Welcome everyone. We're still waiting a little bit for people to join us. There's already, I would like everyone who is not speaking, please to mute your microphones. And there is a little note from our side that this session is already being recorded. So once more, hello everyone. Welcome to this session. We're waiting for 1 minute, I would say. And once more, a note from our side, the session is already being recorded, and please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. All right, so let's start. Again, third time, hello and a warm welcome to our today's panel discussion in the context of the European Sustainable Energy Week. Today we will talk about towards a fair energy transition, enabling vulnerable consumers to take part in energy communities. And as I already said, this session is being recorded. Also, a warm welcome to our panelists today, which we will present in a minute. Just as some background information, the session is co-organized by the Right to Energy Coalition, which is an advocacy coalition fighting against energy poverty, Climate Alliance, and the European University Viadrina, which are representing the Horizon 2020 project SCORE, which has the objective to implement an inclusive financing and participation instrument in renewable energy communities to facilitate the participation of underrepresented groups in energy transitions. Probably you all have read the description of our today's session. We are talking about the challenge in the energy transition, which is not just about decarbonizing our economies, but also to find new innovative ways to engage and enable energy consumers to take part in the energy transition and simultaneously tackling energy poverty. So today we will talk about these issues. We will also talk about especially concrete obstacles and challenges, but also opportunities when it comes to addressing social inclusion in the context of energy communities to mitigate energy poverty. Yeah, in general, we thought about having two different thematic blocks in this session. The first one is kind of called Energy Communities and the Fight Against Energy Poverty, Convergence for a Fair Inclusive Transition. And the second block will tackle the current COVID-19 situation and the green recovery. To establish also a gender balance in the moderation team, my colleague Claire Gauthier, also from the European University Viadrina, will moderate the second block, and myself, I will moderate the first block. Well, we all know that due to the COVID-19 situation, we had to organize our discussion today online. Please note that we will not have individual presentations of our panel guests today, but we will start into a discussion directly. We would also obviously encourage all of you in our audience to ask questions. And if you want to ask questions, just use the chat and type in your question. We have Marie-Claire Schulte from Climate Alliance in the background, who is responsible and organizing all the technical parts of this session, and she will also keep an eye on the questions. And after each block, we will have time for a short Q&A session. So also due to the digital circumstances, we can't really see you. We can't really, you know, engage with our audience in an analog way. So we thought about starting with you and asking some questions. So we prepared some questions that should be shown on your screen momentarily. And the first question, here it is. So the first question is, who are you representing today? So please, yeah, we already have some responses coming in from academia and then also social NGOs, academia again, and then also environmental NGOs. So this is developing very nicely. So about 60% of our audience have already replied, approaching 70%. That's great. So we have quite a diverse audience, mainly from the academic field, from social and environmental NGOs, and also some audience members from the energy sector. So that's already great to know. Welcome again. And yeah, let's, I guess now you can also see that. Great, these are the results. Let's come to our next question, and that is, Marie, can you launch the next question? Yeah, here it is. Where are you from? No, we already had that.
Yes, just a second.
No problem.
Okay.
Here we go. Next question. You know, just to get an idea, and also this is interesting for our panel guests to know a bit, what are you familiar with which concepts? Are you familiar with energy communities and energy poverty, just with energy poverty, with both concepts, or not really familiar with any of the two concepts? And well, there is a majority that is familiar with both concepts, but we also have some people that are not yet familiar with energy poverty and energy communities. And what we're really trying to do today is connect those two and talk about the possibilities, opportunities, but also challenges when it comes to combining both. So here's the final result. And yes, a majority of nearly 70% is familiar with both concepts. That's already great. But also for those that are not yet familiar with the two concepts together, we will come to that during our discussion. So I'm very excited to do that. Yeah, so now you can also see that. Yeah, okay. I would say, I'm not sure, Marie, that's it from the survey part. And now I would hand over to my colleague, Claire Gauthier, who will briefly present our guests today.
Yes, hi everyone. So we got to know you a bit better now. Now we will get to know our speakers a bit better. So I will start with Professor Stefan Buzarowski. He's professor at the University of Manchester for geography. His research interests lie in energy transition and energy poverty, and he's deeply involved in EU policy on a general basis, as he's the chair of both the EU Energy Poverty Observatory, and he's also the chair of the Engager Cost Action, and he's involved in several EU-funded projects, such as the STEP-IN project, who develops methodology to assess energy poverty and to tackle energy poverty. Then we have Barbara Kalka. She's the regional coordinator of the Stromsparcheck initiative at Caritas Germany. The Stromsparcheck initiative trains long-term unemployed to provide energy-poor households and vulnerable consumers with energy-efficient advice, and also in some cases switch non-energy efficient appliances. She's therefore an expert in consumer engagement, a role she fulfills in the Horizon 2020 SCORE project, supporting co-ownership of supporting consumer co-ownership of renewable energy. Then we have Matthias Maucher. He's a senior policy officer at the European Anti-Poverty Network. The EAPN is an umbrella organization for NGOs involved with social policy and energy issues. Last December, he moderated a roundtable on climate justice, the just transition, energy poverty, and the Green Deal at the European Parliament, a role he took on again 2 weeks ago during the final conference of the Assist Together project, where he moderated a roundtable on policy recommendations on energy poverty. Then we have the Euro Deputy the member of European Parliament, Jutta Paulus. She's an MEP since 2019. She represents the Greens European Free Alliance in Germany in the Environmental Committee, and she also substitutes in the Industry, Energy and Research Committee. Her topic of predilection are on sustainable transition, that is climate, energy, environmental protection, and the circular economy, but also on health and chemistry, as she is a pharmacist. And she's involved at a personal level with the topic today, as she is a member of an energy community in her hometown. And finally, we have Josh Roberts, advocacy officer at Rescoop EU, which is a growing federation representing over 1,000 energy cooperatives in Europe and around 1 million consumer and citizen. Whoever was involved with energy communities in the clean energy package the last years must have heard of him at some point, as he is one of the driving forces behind this policy and in the Community Power Coalition, which he also represents today. So thank you to everyone for being here with us today. And now we will get on to the first block.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Thank you once more and welcome to our panelists. In general, when it comes to fighting or tackling energy poverty, we thought that there are mainly two approaches. Firstly, one that focuses mainly on individuals and individual measures to tackle energy poverty, including energy efficiency behavior, but also energy efficiency measures, investments, energy advising to assist energy poor households to reduce energy consumption. And then on a second level, or secondly, we discussed different policies on a macro level. Examples here for our policies encouraging renovations, upgrades to improve energy efficiency, but also targeted social policy measures addressing energy poor households directly, such as social tariffs, energy checks, etc. But in this discussion, the potential of collectors and specifically of energy communities as on an intermediary level and their role when it comes to inclusion and fighting energy poverty is not yet sufficiently acknowledged. This is one of the reasons why we started to think about having the session and discussing these issues a bit more in detail. And my first question goes to Stefan. Maybe to give us an idea of who are energy poor households. Is there a difference to vulnerable consumers, and how are they engaged and involved with, well, let me repeat. Well, let's first of all do these first questions. Who are energy poor households, and is there a difference to vulnerable consumers, Stefan?
Thank you. So this is a sub-question we get a lot. I've been working in the field for over 20 years, and one of the struggles we've had is to distinguish the energy poor from the income poor. People often say, well, you know, it's just another form of poverty, so it's why should we have a special thing called energy poverty? And the reason why we have a special understanding of energy poverty is because the group of energy poor are not always only income poor. So some of them do have low incomes, but households may find themselves in energy poverty due to living in an energy inefficient home very often, or for other reasons like high energy needs due to disability or other reasons. So with there's two Venn diagrams, there's income poverty Venn diagram. If there's an energy poverty Venn diagram, they overlap, but for a large part, energy poor households often may have incomes that will be above the official poverty line in a certain country, but they may struggle for other reasons. Vulnerable consumers was a term that was introduced in 2009. It's a way of describing, it means different things in different countries, but I would say it's a way of describing vulnerability, particularly in relation to maybe the consumption of energy. But if we think of vulnerability more broadly, we could say that people who are vulnerable to energy poverty might not necessarily be vulnerable at any given time, but may become vulnerable due to a change in their circumstances or changes in external circumstances. So vulnerable consumers or vulnerable citizens are generally a much wider pool of people. One thing I should say is that we have very wide variation in who the energy poor are in different countries, with those that have stronger social systems and more energy efficient housing stock. There's a much more direct correspondence between income poverty and energy poverty. In other countries where that's not the case, we have a much wider pool of energy poor households beyond income poverty.
And Stefan, what would you say? How are energy poor households currently engaged with or involved in energy projects in general? And maybe you can also talk about the approach in the STEP-in project.
Sure. So very differently in very different countries. And depending on the group that we're talking about, we may get different levels of participation. Some of them are very, very poorly represented in decision-making processes. Sometimes we call those households the hard to reach. They're often beyond the remit of energy efficiency measures because they are suffering from multiple forms of vulnerability and deprivation, and they're very difficult to access for those who are delivering the efficiency or other assistance measures, and also they are outside of any decision-making processes. In some countries, for example in Spain, those who are vulnerable are very actively involved in decision-making processes. STEP-in is a project funded by the European Union in which there are what we call labs. I lead one of those labs in the city of Manchester. So what we do is we take a whole systems approach. We don't just, we kind of link all those different scales that you mentioned. So because we believe energy poverty is a systemic issue, not an individual issue. So what we do is really identify where people are vulnerable through various measures, but often through self-reporting, but also through external identification, and then we use energy advice, so mediators, to basically deliver energy efficiency and other forms of assistance, and help also with things like fuel switching and maximization of incomes and so on for vulnerable people. So essentially there's an intermediary that helps people become visible, become noticeable, but also helps them get over some of the challenges that they face. Sometimes they refer them to other services that they might help, so they become like a focal point for those services. So that's STEP-in a nutshell, basically. I'll mention it later on in the discussion as well.
Thank you. Josh, the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive states that the participation in renewable energy communities is accessible to all consumers, including those in low income and vulnerable households. Rescoop just published a transposition guideline, especially for renewable energy communities. So in general, what do you think? What role can renewable energy communities play to mitigate energy poverty? And how can low-income households and vulnerable households be participating in renewable energy cooperatives?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Florian, and thanks for having this debate. It's good to have a session that's focused on connecting these two issues. And apologies for my echo. So I'll answer the first of those two questions. What are Rescoops actually doing? So what are energy communities doing? So energy communities actually have a long history of dedicating themselves to fighting energy poverty in a variety of ways. These are cooperative social enterprises that are often looking at providing a community benefit, and therefore they are adopting some philosophies in how they conduct their business that has a very community or social focus. And the first way a lot of these energy cooperatives do this is through solidarity mechanisms. So we have a number of members that if they're a supplier, they have mechanisms whereby a member can donate part of their energy bill that goes to help others that cannot pay their bills, to help them out if they're having trouble. That's one way. And then others they have the cooperative itself is either having programs, or the cooperative itself is designed to tackle energy poverty. So one of our members, for instance, Enercop in France, they actually, you can donate electricity production. I won't go into the ways that you can do that, but they basically take donated electricity production, they sell it on the market, and they take the revenue from that, and it's put into this fund with Energy Solidaire. It's called Energy Solidaire, and it's run by Les Amis de l'Energie. And it's basically run by different social organizations, and they figure out where to donate this to local authorities and local NGOs that are tackling energy poverty. So it's more of a partnership. But then you have energy cooperatives who are basically setting themselves up in social estates where the participants themselves or the beneficiaries are energy poor, vulnerable households. And you usually have some sort of investment mechanism whereby the revenues that are generated from the renewable energy production are going towards programs like draft busting and renovations to improve people's living conditions. There are also other services, but one thing I would probably mention most of all is the bigger space that our members are entering into, and that's housing renovations directly. That's becoming a bigger part of their activities, and that has a direct impact on quality of living and energy usage.
And Josh, what would you say? What do renewable energy communities need to further work on this to increase their potential to mitigate energy poverty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean that gets at one of the first parts of the questions you asked, which was how do vulnerable and low-income households participate in these types of initiatives? And that is often the biggest challenge is the engagement, because obviously. For good reasons, vulnerable households are often concerned with other issues. So some of our members in Greece, for instance, I believe the legislation allows energy communities to supply renewable electricity to vulnerable households, and they don't have to become a member, or cooperatives will reduce the amount of investment, because you usually need to invest an amount of money into the cooperative to become a member. So they will reduce this so that so that the entry fee is lower. In terms of policies, I mean, most of our members do this without any policy support, but one of the things that is interesting for these types of projects is what they can usually get from like a feed-in tariff for being able to sell this renewable electricity on the market. So where, in the UK, they used to have a very favorable feed-in tariff scheme. This was generating a lot of these types of projects in inner cities in London and elsewhere. It was being copied, basically. So this was a good policy mechanism. But I think also local policies that generate partnerships with local authorities, this type of thing, that really helps these go away, because it oftentimes is a lot about local buy-in, and engagement often requires the participation of local authorities as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Josh. Barbara, you're representing the Horizon 2020 project SCORE today. From this experience, and also what Josh said, how do you engage vulnerable consumers and households in the SCORE project? And have you identified specific issues that are opportunities but also barriers to this inclusion?
Yes. So first of all, we find that vulnerable or energy poor consumers are not automatically or do not automatically get involved in their in energy topics. So energy or saving environment is not often related to income or expenses of their personal budget. So they actually need advice, they need guidance, and they need a whole lot of information of how those two aspects connect to each other. So basically they need ideas like SCORE or like our German national project, and they also need facilitations to get into the market, facilitations to getting prosumers at the end of the day. But for this, they need information on how they can invest and how the profit comes back to them. The profit needs to come fast. So low-income consumers are they're not people who invest today because their children will benefit from their investment decision. So if they invest today, they need the profit within a short amortization period. Yeah. But what they also find, and what we find in the SCORE project, is also a completely different level. It's the legal framework that we see. Poor households often receive social transfers, and social transfer prevents them from additional income. So if they invest, which would lead to an additional income, they might run into the risk of receiving low transfers. So actually, they would not even have an advantage in this investment. But this is a very this is not an advantageous situation, not for the households, and also not for the rest of society who wants to get people involved. Many times and in many countries, low income people or people on transfer don't have proper jobs or good jobs or long-term jobs. So if we want to get them involved and want to get people into their self-reliability and into earning their income, we definitely need a different legal framework to giving them the ability to invest and to receive their profit and keep their profit, and not recalculate it with lowering social transfers, as they don't have very much money in the first place. Yeah, so that's it for the first question.
All right. Thank you very much, Barbara. Matthias, the European Commission announced its intention to mainstream energy and climate policy in other policy areas, as well as is developing guidelines on energy poverty. However, social policy is difficult to harmonize at European level. The EU institutions also have the ambition to break policy silos and mainstream energy and climate policy issues and other policies. So our question: how can energy and climate issues policy, how can energy and climate policies be mainstreamed in social policy?
Yeah, thanks, Florian. A very good but not easy to answer question, also for the inputs that Josh and Barbara just gave on different levels. And obviously, we are ERPN are more focusing on social policy. And as you already said, social policy in principle is national competence for the organization, financing, regulation, and so on. EU can frame this, they can coordinate. And so what we would look at is the extent, and I give two examples now, to which recent Commission initiatives have made the effort or already oriented themselves towards this mainstreaming. But I can already say the result is not too encouraging. So obviously the most recent is the European Green Deal of last December. Before Commissioner Timmermans has highlighted in the hearings in the Parliament, he said we mustn't raise energy bills, but lower them. 50 million energy poor are unacceptable. But if we now look into the concrete measures tabled until now, also in the context of the European Green Deal, we don't see much regulation to ensure that lower income households are not paying for just transition, so that costs stemming from this transition of the energy production towards a green, carbon-free, climate-friendly economy are not passed on in terms of higher energy bills or renovation bills to poorer households. The EC proposed merely to assess old legislation, enforce a little bit existing weak laws, and create a platform. And then, as you said, this guidance, but there's not binding legislation. And the same seems to be the case for this just transition mechanism. The second example I want to give is the earlier clean energy package. It also contains, obviously, as you all know, some legislative proposals on energy efficiency and energy performance of buildings. Member states should submit national energy and climate plans, and there's a possibility that also saving measures can be there. There can be a focus on saving measures for vulnerable people or consumers. Same should now be possible with the renovation wave, especially for buildings and social housing. But if we look to the extent to which the European Green Deal and the clean energy package really focus on a regulatory level, also on what would be needed, what Barbara said, for example, now concretely, then we see that not a lot has happened. So it's a laudable, obviously, idea, but also for the reasons Barbara mentioned, it will be difficult to start this only from the social policy angle, because social policy, first of all, is there, for example, to save income, prevent poverty and all, and you cannot overburden it from the start for all the households that need it with all the other considerations. So the considerations should come in first of all via the energy and climate policy, because you cannot oblige all poor households that they, for example, invest in energy communities, obviously. But as also said by Josh, what would be needed is to lower this, whatever the thresholds, for example, for buying shares, or to have this arrangement he mentioned for Greece. So that's the first answer to this question.
Thank you. Maybe you can just quickly elaborate on what's the European Anti-Poverty Network and also the Right to Energy Coalition doing in this context.
Yeah, perhaps most important point is, and that's linked to the first question, is that we would call for, we have already called for something we call a systematic ex ante social and distributional impact assessment of, in this case, the energy or climate policies, to see what is the impact on the income, on the possibilities to use social transfers, to reinvest, all what was said. What is the impact on the low-income household? So that should happen, as the optimization of these policies has to come first of all from our, at least on our view, from the energy and the climate policies, and then obviously there should be openness on the social policy side to take up the positive elements that energy communities can present. And unfortunately, we don't know yet the details of this EC guidance on energy poverty, but obviously it should exactly encourage what we have just said, is mainstreaming of also climate-friendly policy measures and all the other issues into the social policy. But we are not sure that this would happen. And perhaps a good hook is, because the Parliament will come in now, that the European Parliament has indeed done early this year a good resolution that calls on the fact that the fight against energy poverty should be done, but in a way, or the climate policy should be done, but in a way not to increase the burden, the financial burden to poor households. Also applauds the contribution of communities fighting energy poverty, because they are equipped to do this, and also says that in the renovation wave now, again, we should see that the cost is not passed on to poor households. So perhaps this could be exactly the hook to work towards this mainstreaming. There are several good hooks in this resolution of the Parliament.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that brings us to Jutta. The European Commission announced in December the publication of energy poverty guidelines for 2020. It also currently works on the transposition guidelines for RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive. The Right to Energy Coalition has provided an overview already on how the different political groups engage or not with energy poverty, also in the Green Deal. And energy communities have a strong basis in green politics. So, Jutta, from your perspective, how are the Greens / the European Free Alliance cooperating with other groups on these topics? And maybe you can also provide us with an idea of what's happening in the Parliament currently on these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I have already learned a lot, so it's been worthwhile without even having said anything yet. Yes, I mean, what we are actually trying is that we try to bring this issue into every legislative proposal where it's remotely located. For example, I mean, this is a very obvious one. We had right at the moment, the initiative report from the ITRE committee on the energy efficiency of buildings, where the ENVI committee could give an opinion. And so we were working very, very closely with all political groups, but of course also with NGOs, with alliances, associations on exactly this issue, because energy efficiency in buildings addresses exactly this topic. What, as Stefan has said, energy poverty is not necessarily restricted to income poverty, but also to people who have a solid income, but the house or the flat is so energy inefficient that a lot of their money just goes out the window or up the chimney, whatever you call it. So what we made sure, and I'm very glad that we found a broad majority, at least in the Envy committee, where I was working on the opinion, is that energy efficiency must also become an asset actually for energy poor households, also for example, social housing, public buildings where there are flats rented to people with lower income. So I think we need to get this angle into our policies that are remotely related to energy, not only renewable energy directive, not only energy efficiency, but we should also see the connections to other topics. For example, I was not so happy on the about the discussion when it comes to hydrogen. We will take a huge amount of money, and this will lead to a relatively modest amount of jobs. Where if we put this public money into the renovation wave, we could create millions of jobs all over Europe. That would reduce energy poverty and income poverty.
So Jutta, what would you say? Are you working currently with other EU institutions on these issues, or with national and local constituencies? And in general, is there in these discussions, is there an attention for this linkage between energy communities and energy poverty, or is that rather a niche debate?
I must admit it's rather a niche debate, because at least in my home country, in Germany, the energy communities are often energy cooperatives. So every member will buy shares of a certain amount. Mostly the cooperatives have a very low threshold so that you can participate even with 100 euros or something, so that it's really open to a very broad part of society, so to speak. But still the link between energy communities and energy poverty is hardly ever seen, because for the reasons that have been addressed earlier, that if you receive transfer money, then any income on shares of energy communities or energy cooperatives would have been deduced from this transfer again. I think it is addressed in a way when it comes to the so-called Mieterstrom, which means that not necessarily an energy community, but any investor can do so, put photovoltaics on the roof of a rental building, and then the people who live in those flats can consume the solar energy from their own roof at a very low price. And that's of course addressing both issues at once, but it's not restricted to energy communities.
Thank you very much, Jutta. I would now quickly look into our group chat. Are there any questions from the audience that we could address right now? Claire, do you have any question collected?
Yeah, so Marjorie Barrage, I don't know if I pronounced it right, was basically asking about a specific form of vulnerability, about domestic violence survivors, and she explained how this kind of phenomenon can also have energy poverty impact, because often those victims of domestic violence also have are not having the same earning power. And she asked how can I guess energy communities help in addressing this issue. She also suggested she offered a suggestion of minimum usage-free tariff temporarily as a way of supporting this. Maybe Josh, do you want to react to this? Are there already examples of energy communities? I'm guessing maybe in Spain, because maybe, I mean, I heard that Spain is one of the best practice country to address domestic violence issues. So yeah, Josh.
Actually, I won't go to Spain. I do have an example. It's not directly on point, but it is pretty on point, and it's actually from Greece. And I believe that under the collective self-consumption legislation, one of the local authorities helped create a renewable energy community that provides renewable electricity and donates it to a battered women's shelter. And this is, I mean, this would be, it would be, they could do this without any sort of specific reference, but in the legislation on energy communities in Greece, you actually have a sort of important sort of directional passage in there, and that is that they basically state some of the aims of energy communities, and one of these is to help combat energy poverty. So in that sense, it elevates energy poverty as an issue that can be tackled by energy communities. Therefore, it gets stakeholders or people who would uptake this concept to think about how they can actually use this as a tool. So I think that's kind of important, and I would echo everybody that's already spoken. This is relatively new in the policy landscape, so you're not really going to find a lot. But already, you know, with this mention of energy poverty in the definition, it can do a lot of help already.
Thank you, Josh. Is there anyone else from the panel who wants to add something on that question? Otherwise, we have a second question coming in. So I would say we go to the second question, and that is Gabriele, who is asking about gender issues or gender balances in energy communities in general and energy poverty. So the question is, is gender a relevant concept in this debate? And I don't know who wants to pick up this aspect and maybe link gender aspects with energy poverty and then also participation in renewable energy communities. And I'm not sure if Josh wants to add later on if there are best practice examples on these issues as well. Josh?
Sure. Yeah, I was seeing if somebody else wanted to jump in this. I can say something though. I mean, I think this is relevant in two ways. I mean, the inclusion issue is probably a little bit separate, I would say, because when you're talking about energy communities, you're talking about investments. Therefore, you're talking about a segment of the population that's going to be likely to participate. So the major question for the movement, in order for it to be able to grow, is how do we engage people that would not likely participate? And some of that has to do with reducing the financial barriers, but it also has to do with outreach. And in our network, we have a sort of gender outreach network that promotes women in cooperatives, and not just participating, but in becoming a leader in those cooperatives. But I mean, practically speaking, you know, women, gender is an issue because when you're talking about vulnerability, it disproportionately impacts women. If you're a single family household, you're more likely to be a woman and facing the challenges that come along with that. So certainly, I think it does play both sides of the coin there.
Thank you, Josh.
I would like to add that gender is probably rather an issue to come I mean, it is like from social policy point of view, it should be a big issue, as investments could mainly be made by males, because women have a far higher poverty risk for the reasons Josh just mentioned. So I think gender is an underrepresented issue, but there are projects like SCORE, for example, who define women as a special part of their target group to deal with and to push the issue forward more than it's been pushed in the past.
Thank you. And Stefan, you wanted to say something as well?
So something very briefly. I mean, one of the challenges that we have with gender is that it's invisible in the statistics. We don't disaggregate below the household level, so we don't really understand intra-household inequalities very well in statistics, but also in research and analysis. So one challenge for the future is to think about indicators and measures that can give us that sense of inequality. So the only indicator that we have is the single parent household that kind of gives us a sense that this is a big issue, but there are other challenges. I'd say also it's important to think about what practices of gender inequality arise, not just to count participation of women in particular projects or as numbers reached, but whether in fact the forms that lead to gender inequality, the processes are being dismantled. For example, the marginalization of women within decision-making processes, both at the company level, so within the running of the energy sector, but also in terms of these questions that were raised, for example, of household violence and so on. What the crisis has done is that it has kind of locked the patriarchal household in, it has verified under conditions of lockdown. So we really need to think very carefully and very thoroughly about all the practices of inequality around gender that arise in relation to energy poverty, and there are many multiple ones. There's been a few very interesting contributions recently that have started to unpack this. I'm happy to share with people later on.
Thank you, Stefan. And there's another question from Mathieu. Except a discount on the energy bill, is there any other positive outcomes of membership to an energy community for vulnerable consumers? I think that's also a very relevant question. Jutta?
Okay, yes. I guess that depends on the energy community, basically. So, for example, I mean, I'm a member in more than one community. I co-founded the one in my hometown, but I have bought some shares all over Germany just to support the regional energy community. And for example, one of them said they will, for example, give people who have an old house, but they don't have the necessary means to do the renovation by themselves. So they will do a contracting, so that the energy savings will pay off for the investment. They offer much more favorable conditions than an ordinary energy company would do, or another cooperative I know of. They said, well, we will make a joint order of energy efficient household appliances, so that people would get a rebate on the price, which is of course paying off not only for the actual purchase, but also for the energy consumption in future. That's it.
Thank you, Jutta. And yeah, Josh, you have to unmute your microphone.
Sorry, I thought I did. Yeah, there are multiple different types of benefits from this. I mean, for instance, in Brixton, one of the really good projects there, Repowering London, they have a mentor internship program. So they're training the next generation in the renewable energy sector and giving them opportunities. The renewable energy projects were the start of, they now have community gardening. So this is more than just about individual household. This is building a community of networked people that can help each other in other ways. So, I mean, and you're right. I mean, when it comes down to brass tacks, it's about the energy bill, but how do you get there? You're also teaching people a little bit about energy. You're not just giving them, you know, a top up on their so that they can pay their electricity meter. You're giving them access to renewable energy. So, I mean, it's changing the way they think, the way they react, and it's bringing them along with the energy transition, which is an important question that a lot of people are asking themselves. You know, why are we giving you know, subsidies or public support to renewables, and how do we mitigate the impacts on the people that can't participate? That is a very relevant question, but I also like to flip that on its back and say, why can't we try to include as many people as possible in the energy transition? I think that's just as important as the other question.
Thank you, Josh. And Matthias, just a quick response.
Indeed. I think that's a good example for how you could link social and energy poverty, because obviously social policy looks, as you just said, or the question asked, for social tariffs, but energy communities have the potential for participation and empowerment, again, also for women, single households, single family households, what we had before, parent households. So I think that would need to be done, but it's a complex thinking, because currently you look at the income situation of a household and then apply a social tariff, but the link is there with the benefit also of empowering and participatory logic, but that's not in the cash benefit logic of the social transfer. So, but there is some food for thought to bridge the two topics, and that's, I think, for today. But there's no easy answer, but would need to start from both sides, social policy and energy. But I would take this hook of participation and empowering, that is a key feature of energy communities.
Thank you very much. We have one final question from Vladimir. In certain countries, for example, North Macedonia and Bulgaria, poor households are provided with monthly monetary amounts so that they can cover their basic energy expenditures. The social aid could be redirected towards supporting community investments, for example, subsidies for renewable energy sources projects implemented by third parties. Could the panel maybe discuss this model? Who wants to give a quick reaction to this approach? Yes, Stefan.
I think that we shouldn't, I don't know why we always have to, when it comes to vulnerable people, be in a position of either or. I mean, it's a good model to have renewable energy investment for a vulnerable household, but then they should be also deprived of a very minor amount of money that they receive to meet their basic needs. You know, I can talk about this in the literature, it's shown that it's so. And apart from being extremely unjust, it's also very unproductive in many other ways. It creates other problems down the line. So I think it's the discourse of scarcity should not be applied to vulnerable people. Quite the opposite. We should find ways of increasing the funding that is available for them, and it should be funded through general taxation, which again has been proven to be more equitable as opposed to funding through energy bills, for example.
Thank you, Stefan. And Josh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just one thing to add on to that. I mean, you're also talking about trade-offs, so we can also apply this to the situation of islands where people pay. They don't actually pay because this is subsidized, and the subsidies come to import heavily polluting, dirty fossil fuels. And so, I mean, you can either pay for this, or you can provide them with their own energy access, renewable energy access, and clean energy. And so, you know, there's the obvious trade-off there. So, I mean, I agree. I'm not an expert on this, so I wouldn't pretend to say that we should trade one for the other. I mean, I guess my simplistic mind thinks that if you help somebody take care of their energy needs, that they can, you know, place their mind elsewhere to other aspects of their life. But if you're going to do that with electricity, you might as well do it with renewable electricity.
Thank you. And with that, I would say we close the Q&A session of this first part, and I hand the floor to Claire Gauthier, who will moderate the second session.
Thank you, Florian. Yeah, so we are now moving to Block 2, which is dedicated to the current economic crisis and its impact on energy poverty, energy communities, and EU policy through the Green Recovery Plan. We are meeting online today because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and EU leaders have met already in the last weeks to discuss the recovery plan in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in light with the multi-financial framework, so the budget discussion and the Green Deal. I will I will dive in right in a really hot event, and starting with MEP Paulus. So today, the French leader Macron, the French president, and the German Chancellor Merkel are meeting today ahead of the German presidency, which will start on 1st of July. They were the driving forces of this recovery plan. And my question is, what's your current assessment of the negotiation, and how the German presidency will influence this? And also, what's your take on the role of Parliament in this?
Yeah, that's, I have mixed feelings, let's call it that way, because originally the European Parliament passed a very ambitious resolution on a recovery plan, which is, in our view, necessary for recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, with businesses all over Europe striving to avoid bankruptcy. And the European Parliament called for a massive investment plan, much higher sums than those that were mentioned by Merkel and Macron on their previous meeting. But we have seen that the negotiations for the multi-annual financial framework get stuck, sort of, because member states still are at odds with each other when it comes to who pays back the debt, when will it be paid back, which debt are we actually talking about, should there be a transfer to member states which have been hit more than others. So these are still questions that are unresolved, and I really hope that the finance ministers in their next meeting will come to their senses and see what responsibility they have. I was very taken aback when I was reading an article in a German newspaper by where they had interviewed Manfred Weber, who is the head of the EPP group in the European Parliament, because Weber suddenly did a 180 degrees turn, saying we EPP are not so sure whether we should go on with the Green Deal, because we really need a robust impact assessment first, whether our economy can really get along with too much climate ambition. And I was quite surprised, so to speak, that EPP is siding with ECR, European Conservative and Reformers, which is Peace Party in Poland, and so, and these people, and saying that climate ambition is actually a threat to economy, whereas I think climate ambition, especially when it comes to energy efficiency, especially when it comes to renewable energy, is actually a huge opportunity for European industry for recovering in a safe and sustainable way. Also when it comes, for example, to circular economy, we now have the chance to use these huge sums which are necessary to save the economy, because economy is also income for people. People need to put bread on the table and pay their rent. To use these immense sums to transform our economy. And so I was, as I said, I did not quite believe my eyes, seeing that EPP was backing away, especially with Manfred Weber being a German, and he knows very well that it will be Germany's task to bring the multi-annual financial framework to a good end, and also to make sure that the Green Deal doesn't get stopped before it has even started. I have a very good confidence in Angela Merkel, actually, because she seems to have understood what's at stake, but I'm not so sure whether everyone in the German government is on the same page here. Thank you.
Thank you for this clear answer. And I believe we have to release you because you are speaking in another panel in a few minutes. So thank you very much already. And we'll hear from you. Thank you. So let's move on to the next question. And again, on the recovery plan, I would like to ask Matthias and Josh about their assessment of it for now regarding the Green Deal and regarding specifically energy communities and energy poverty. Maybe Josh, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. So, I mean, just for clarification, I've only been able to see what's been in the communication by the Commission on the Green Recovery Plan. And I mean, I have to say that it kind of reflects my perception of what the Green Deal has meant to energy communities generally, and we blogged on that. And that is, we're still kind of scratching our heads as to how relevant all of this is for energy communities. I mean, there are a lot of initiatives that are directly relevant. The renovation wave, the flagship initiative of the Commission comes to mind, the Just Transition Fund, the enhanced investment opportunities under InvestEU, under the Common Agricultural Policy, the Connecting Europe facility. You know, there are a lot of words in these communications that emphasize local, and I was happy to hear that earlier or last week, Katrina Stickow, she's the new director of internal market. She did say that there would be support for energy communities under the renovation wave. But other than that, there hasn't really been there have been no concrete details elaborated by the Commission about the role that energy communities can play or how they will directly support energy communities with these initiatives. So for me, I'm sort of still scratching my head to see actually how, you know, the links are there, the relevance is obviously there, but in terms of concrete details, I'm just not sure.
Thank you, Josh. Maybe a follow-up, because I see that we are not so late on time management. So have you heard about, do you have feedbacks from your members on the impact of the economic crisis on energy communities compared to maybe traditional energy companies? Are they more resilient? Do they face the same difficulties? Do they engage even more with energy poor households now than before? Josh?
Sorry, I thought you were directing that question to somebody else. Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, there are a lot of examples, and you can see these on our Twitter account, about how different communities are sort of, they're basically using the crisis to come together. I mean, cooperatives, you know, they're not just about energy. They're about any service that people can come together to provide themselves through co-ownership and investment together. It's an investment contract between people to help each other out commonly. And so, you know, this transcends energy, but in terms of, you know, how they're looking at this crisis, they're often seeing, you hear them saying, how can we help? How can we help our members? How can we help the local community? Which is not the narrative you always hear at a time like this. It's very polarized, and people are very, you know, black and white. But so in this sense, it's kind of positive to see that our members are addressing this issue that way. In terms of the impact, we haven't really seen so much yet. I mean, what you did see after the last economic crisis was this classic debate about we shouldn't be investing in renewables, we need to shore up our old aging industries that are already in trouble. So I expect this to just make things a lot worse, and you already see it with the political debate that you just mentioned. So I expect that, and I expect a lot more attacks on getting rid of supports for renewables generally, but I mean, this is the landscape that we are in.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Matthias, what's your assessment of the recovery plans? Because of course the current crisis directly impacts energy poor or not, or generally poor households and vulnerable households. So how is your assessment of this and the assessment of the Right to Energy Coalition? I believe you're also an expert in the European semester. The recommendation got out, I think, at the beginning of June. So yeah.
I start also with the last point, because what we have seen also, and that's part of the semester a little bit at least is, and of COVID, that what has happened in some countries is that there was a ban of evictions for rental housing, at least for several months due to COVID, when people could not pay the rent, or not the full rent anyway. So that is in a way a positive, also positive measures in many countries. But I remember from France, it was only limited initially to 2 or 3 months, and our French members, for example, were struggling. Same for Czech Republic, and what now happens with the déconfinement, so with the end of all these measures. And to go back to your initial question, indeed, I mean, I can what Josh said on energy communities, I can say, and I said it before in the first intervention, we don't see that there is a real strong focus if you look at the regulatory framework to support investment and a focus on energy poor, or to prevent from costs being shifted on them, if it's for renovations, if it's from increased fuel prices, but also from increased costs that are linked to climate protection policies, which is obviously no problem that there are costs, but costs linked to just transition. So I can only echo what I said before and what Josh said. We don't see this, and coming up with energy with EC guidelines where we don't even see if they could at least help a little bit, even if they are not binding, is not so is not, and we don't know the contents by now, and we don't get them, is not so helpful. So I would take up what I said before, and let's see what now these investment instruments, also these big funds there, like this public sector loan capacity, also in the renovation wave or whatever, how they will be phrased. And that's my last link again to the European semester. And European semester in general, you can always, and the Commission does this, can put conditionalities on the use of EU fund, normally for us fighting against poverty, but here also there could be a conditionality, for example, that certain measures or certain money can only be spent by member states or topped up by member state money for funds, also European Social Fund, others, if certain policy objectives are pursued. And that could be also that they are effective in the fight against energy poverty, or that they really promote a just transition, or that there are even incentives towards more participatory democratic models. And on this, we don't have seen that this has already happened. So that's my reaction to this.
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, so initially I wanted to start this blog by really talking about the impact of the economic crisis on energy poor households. I had to switch questions due to Jutta, who had to leave a bit early. But yeah, now we can finish with that maybe. So Stefan and Barbara, you are both, I'm sorry, you are both involved with field research with European funded projects which deal with consumer engagement. Can you maybe please briefly explain how were your projects impacted by the crisis, and more generally, how have you observed how energy poor households were impacted by this crisis? And yeah, maybe Barbara, you can start with that. Your micro is off.
Oops, sorry. It's been pretty hard to step into a crisis like we have now from basically one day to the next, because projects, especially Horizon projects, they live of exchange and meetings and building networks and also of mutual training. So pretty much everything has changed. But on the project level, you could adjust to that, of course. But at the same time, you have the households you want to address, and they face significantly higher energy consumption as people spend more time at home. So they do everything that they might do at other places. So they cook, they watch TV, they use light, they use water. And energy poor households are much more affected by a crisis like this, because again, transfers or stable income do not go in parallel. So they do not develop in the same way like the expenses do, and thus any crisis, and especially also an energy crisis, hits low income households a lot more than an average household or even a high income family. Also, what we find that a crisis that like hits you in the middle of your everyday life really draws attention away from energy topics or from environmental topics, and in poor households even more. So you just have to use your network and your mediators to get this topic back into the minds, because as we know, energy consumption and available money just affect you in the same way. It goes somewhat in parallel, but you have to find or you have to create new awareness for this. So as far as SCORE is concerned, you need intermediaries, you need structures, and you just have to kind of rebuild them on the way back to contacts to help you create awareness, and some structures you just have to rebuild from the beginning.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah.
I will now hand the floor to Stefan Buzarowski. You had last week the annual conference of the EU Energy Poverty Observatory, and I believe you also presented a report on energy poverty in the NECPs. Can you tell us a bit more about it, please?
Sure, I can, but also can I say something about the previous point, which Barbara was talking about, just to echo what she said. Yes. And I'm involved also in the Step-In project is presently doing work in the field with vulnerable people during the lockdown, during the pandemic. And as now we're exiting through lockdown, so we've gathered quite a lot of experience and evidence about what's happening. And indeed, just what Barbara said, it's very challenging. I think it's challenging from 3 respects. And the problem is that we are not addressing all of those in the current policies that exist. So one respect is obviously the drop in income, which some countries have put in temporary measures and so on. But what happens when those measures expire? It's going to hit those households significantly. Another is the issue of how energy is used. And indeed, there's a rise in energy consumption. There's a changing of energy, of roles within the home. Again, that I think has significant, for example, gender impacts, but also generally energy costs are rising for households. And because partly of the teleworking in some cases, or just simply being at home in others. And so that has a that again, some countries have brought in measures for that, and they were, by the way, addressed in a special study that's included in the observatory report, those temporary measures. But I think more significantly, there's a third dimension which kind of is overlooked, which kind of connects to the communities question. And it's simply the fact that a lot of the networks, the infrastructures that sustain everyday life have been fundamentally transformed. And in those conditions, vulnerable people find themselves often more vulnerable. It means that you can't rely on your social networks in the same way that you could. It means that perhaps sources of support that were there have suddenly evaporated. It means that you're reliant on different forms of transport as well, which makes a difference for people moving, for example, to work and so on. So there's all these additional community and urban level factors that make things very complicated, and for that we don't have simple answers. Because again, I want to emphasize this, energy poverty is not something that is just about individual households, it's about how we organize our lives in communities and cities. And if we don't address that dimension, individual measures based on particular economic and financial eligibility don't necessarily work. I mean, those are questions that are addressed in the latest report by the EU Energy Poverty Observatory, the Pan-EU Energy Poverty Report, which you can find on the observatory website. If you go to www.energypoverty.eu and then go to observatory documents, it's in under Pan-EU reports. It's a third report. It's also published with the EU Energy Publications Office. It's an extensive report that analyzes not only, for example, as I mentioned, we commissioned a group of experts to do this work around responses to COVID-19, but also there's an analysis of energy poverty in the NECPs, as you mentioned, and an evaluation of member states' responses to the imperative to include energy poverty in the NECPs, and we find very, very different levels of engagement with energy poverty, from some countries really taking quite significant action to others almost not mentioning it in the NECPs. So, and we have also a huge discussion of various measures that have been undertaken across the EU. So if people want to read it, I realize time is limited, they can, but I think the one thing I would say is that we are still in that position where, and this was mentioned before, because there are very few obligatory measures around energy poverty, it's all down to member states. Some member states take it seriously, others do not in the European Union context. And the situation is even more varied when you go to the local level. So again, some cities take it seriously and others do not. The problem we have, and this is a problem we've had for many years, is that sometimes some authorities, whether they be regional or national, will brand as energy poverty policies much more general income or infrastructure support policies. So they will say, oh, well, we've got, I don't know, an energy efficiency program, or around replacing some, doing some retrofits, or we've got an income support program for low-income households around energy, and they brand them as energy poverty programs, but they are in fact income support programs or energy efficiency programs. And to have a genuine energy poverty program, you need to integrate all those dimensions. So you need to target people who are struggling with getting energy through improving energy efficiency and other aspects. And that's difficult to do because you have to work across different sectors, and it's not really happening across Europe. It's happening in some places, but I think it's a huge challenge, and I don't see it going away soon, despite all of these very ambitious measures that are being touted at the moment.
Well, thank you, Stefan, because I think it's a nice transition to your conclusion now. Yeah, I think this is a great transition, because that's something that we wanted to show with our session today, that both those topics are important, that they are present in the European legislation, although we could still say it's not enough. And we wanted also to show that both those topics can be brought together and are complementary. Then again, this discussion is still happening at the EU level, and really soon, this discussion will also have to transfer to national and local policies. And maybe, so I still have, I think, 3 survey questions to conclude our topic. Yeah, but I wanted to have a final statement first. Sorry, Marie.
Sorry.
A final statement first from our speakers. Basically, we are still discussing this at the EU level, but what do you think is the next step to bring energy poverty initiatives, energy communities together? Sorry, I will, let's start with Matthias.
Yeah, again, also a big challenge, but what you can always do is, and from our side, I reflected on this, it has been an important issue for several of our members. But again, now, as you say, the transition needs to be done from regulatory, European, national level or whatever to concrete cooperation at a local level. And on this, unfortunately, also European networks, if they come more from the energy community, or in this case, from the energy poor and the energy precarity part, they cannot give orders, and it's a question of capacity. Yeah, but I think this type of on both sides, capacity also, and then obviously the right political framework, as we have said, from where do you optimize social policy or climate and energy policy and regulation, and it needs probably to come from both sides. But then it's a question of capacity, and that only making this link, as we try to do today, can help that then your national members, local initiatives or whatever, find together and, for example, from an energy poverty angle, indeed look into very concretely into possibilities how with very low investment and without having negative impact on your social transfers, you can get involved in this type of energy communities, for example, because it is reflecting this element of participatory and empowering. And what Stefan said at the end now was really also one of the major or the key recommendation from this assist project, namely to target indeed to prioritize investment into energy efficiency, especially in social housing and for those in damp rental houses. So around this, I think everything can be shaped, but we can only put a framework and see where there are difficulties on the regulatory level, but then the initiatives need to work together on a local, regional level. So that's what I would like to add.
Thank you. Barbara, maybe do you want to react and have your final statements also?
Yes, I think we need a lot of information and empowerment on the one hand to strengthen local and regional activities, and also to include as many people from all social groups as possible. And then on the other hand, legislation and political developments have to be synchronized to this process, because, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do not we cannot really promote participation if people do not see any need. You know, a lot of people, especially people in transfer, do not see the need to become active. So we try to get them active, but it doesn't help them to get back to real participation within society on very many topics, but especially not in the field of energy. As energy is not a topic whose contents are very close to the majority of people. So they have to be taught, and on the other hand, policies have to develop to support this process on the local level.
Thank you, Barbara. And I may add, you said even if we can convince energy poor households to participate, there's still some obstacles. And what we had seen also in the SCORE project is that even when there's solution to be more inclusive and and include energy poor households in energy communities, there's also still some policy obstacles. And here I would refer to welfare policies, where what we identified the welfare dilemma, where basically energy poor households are still prevented to invest in energy communities. Otherwise, they would be threatening their eligibility or their basically receiving welfare benefits, because in a large portion of member states, receiving welfare benefits is dependent on liquidating previous assets.
Yeah, in the first place, I think we might need some transition period for each household, so that you, for example, say for the first 3 years after investment, you can keep the additional income, and then we see if you get yourself out of social transfer, or if you fall back into social transfer, or if you really make a development towards a self-reliant and self-organized lives away from from public support. I think this is like that would be a first step. So you're really motivated to invest some little part of your very little income.
Yeah, so thank you, Barbara. That really shows that even when there's an intent to bring together and to have those solutions, there are still very much concrete problems in doing that. Final statement, maybe, Josh and Stefan still have to express themselves. Maybe Stefan first? No?
No, that's okay.
Okay, then Josh?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I won't say anything new here. I think I'll just reiterate. And I mean, energy communities have been focusing on this topic for a long time. Again, without any prodding, it's because they really want to do it. But now there are some policy levers that really need to go into action to support these energy communities that want to help tackle this issue. And again, I'm really glad we are having this talk because, I mean, from what I've seen in the transposition process so far, there really hasn't been any movement on this issue in particular, linking energy communities to energy poverty. And I exemplify this in the transposition guidance document that we have released. We are using examples from the US to show how certain policies are either incentivizing or requiring community projects, or are giving incentives to individuals to participate in community projects in order to allow for a more inclusiveness from lower income households. So that to my knowledge, there are no member state EU policies that are making this connection. What I'm hoping, but many member states are also not connecting renewable energy communities to energy efficiency as a topic. And these two topics are highly interlinked and need to be promoted more. So in my mind, this is just as much of an education issue as it is a policy issue, because unless policymakers are educated, they can't create the policies. But we need this conversation to happen. So I don't know how we continue this, but I'm glad that this is a start, and it really needs to get elevated in the conversation, because if we can't make this concept more inclusive, it will not be nearly as successful as it could be as a social innovative tool.
Thank you, Josh. That wraps up our discussion. Now I would like to ask survey questions to our audience. Marie, yes. So the first one is, how do you rate the potential of energy communities to mitigate energy poverty? We wanted to show that it could be done. There are some best practice examples, but you might be still skeptical or not. Apparently not. Although only 36% of our audience has responded now, but yeah, I mean, not, yeah. 50%. Now at least it's somewhat representative. But basically, yeah, a majority of our audience is highlighting that it's relevant to speak of both together. That was the point of our session. And I think this discussion, as Josh mentioned, needs to continue either at the European level, the national level, local level, inside projects. So yeah, it's good that we seem to be on the same page for this. Next question. Coming out of this session, do you want to hear more about energy communities, energy poverty, or recovery plans? What we want to know with this question is that where does the priority lies for you on the policy level? So almost half of the respondents answered, more than half, and it's quite yeah, balanced, I would say. So there's no clear priorities being emerging. So maybe that's also results that would say there's a need to connect topics better because they are quite reinforcing, and no topic is actually emerging as a clear priority against others. So it could be a way to find political consensus in policies. Finally, our last question, survey question. Do you want, yeah, exactly, European, national, local policy makers to focus more on? Yeah, so we will see what the answer will be. But I guess it's also quite coherent with the previous question. You want to hear more about the 3 topics, but you want to also see those 3 topics more combined in policy discussions. So yeah, I think that's a good wrap up for our session today. I'm thanking the speakers, of course, the audience. And I would also like to thank, of course, my colleague Florian Hanke, who co-moderated with me, Marie, who co-organized and co-hosted this session with me, and also the Right to Energy Coalition, who helped us co-organize this session. Thank you, everyone, and I hope that the discussion will continue wherever you are. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.